Hello and good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this special Jamlab Meetup with the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism to discuss a few key findings from this year's digital news report, which includes Nigeria for the first time this year. The focus for our conversation for today will be on Africa. My name is Chabalala and I head up the Jamlab project here at Viz Journalism. Joining me today is Nick Newman, who is the lead author of the digital news report at the Reuters Institute. We have Chris Roper in the room, who is the Deputy Chief Executive at COFO Africa, who also authored the South Africa and Nigeria sections of the report. We have Adesola Afolabi, who is the Deputy Editor at Stears Business in Nigeria. We've got Ron Derby, who is the Editor-in-Chief at Mail and Guardian in South Africa, and Jamila Mohamed, who is the Managing Editor at Citizen TV. So before we get into today's conversation, I just want to do a bit of housekeeping. If you can, please share and tweet today's conversation on social media using the hashtag Jamlab Meetup and DNR21. We really want this to be a discussion and would like you to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen for any questions directed to the speakers. And then for all the comments, the queries, please leave those in the chat function. Just so you're aware, this meetup is being recorded and will be available on all various digital platforms in different formats after this session. So for today's conversation about the report that was released by the Reuters Institute last week, our conversation will focus on the African continent and delve into what the findings from the report mean for the news market in our region. Nick, can you begin by giving us a snapshot of the findings, and then Chris will jump in after you to speak to Africa, and then we can get into the discussion.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone, and really pleased to be here to share some of our overall findings from this year's report. This is, as you've said, this is our 10th digital news report. We started with just 5 countries, and we now are in 46 different media markets as part of our mission to bring data and evidence to more countries around the world, and really delighted that we now cover 3 countries in Africa. So as you said, Nigeria this year, Kenya we added in 2020, and South Africa in 2019. So we have 3 years of data from South Africa. Just a word about the methodology. So it's based on a survey, an online poll, and as such, it will underrepresent traditional news behaviors like television, print, and radio. And obviously, that's particularly important in the 3 African countries that are included, because a significant proportion of the population is not online, and therefore is more reliant on those other forms of media. So we should think of the samples as representative of a predominantly English-speaking online population because of the limitations of polling. And in Kenya and Nigeria in particular, we're talking about a slightly younger sample as well. Polling was conducted on our behalf by the research agency YouGov, working with partners, and we did the poll in early February 2021, and about 2,000 in each of the markets, including Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria. As you can see there, the report is supported by 14 different organizations, so it's completely independent, includes the BBC, Google, News Initiative, media regulators, industry organizations, and academic institutions around the world. So our last poll was in just before coronavirus hit in 2020, and then this year we've done a poll at a time when the impact varied considerably across countries. So much of Europe was kind of in lockdown in the midst of a second wave. Other countries, few cases or restrictions. So, but as we sort of compare before coronavirus and after coronavirus, we can see a few interesting continuing effects. So firstly, television news has managed to retain at least part of that sort of initial huge surge. Everyone sort of felt they had to turn the television on to find out what was happening with COVID. You can see it there in South Africa, which is the blue line at the top, up from 68% in 2020 to 74% in 2021. And you can also see significant upticks in many European countries, especially those with sort of well-trusted public service and commercial broadcasters. Of course, it remains to be seen if that's just a temporary blip related to lockdown. In sharp contrast to TV news, this next chart shows how COVID has really negatively affected print in terms of weekly weekly use because of problems of sort of distribution and access due to COVID. And we see these very significant falls, not just in Europe, but in almost every country in our survey, and some falls in South Africa there too. And because so many media companies, especially in Africa, rely on print income, both sales and advertising, this is really having a disproportionate effect on the finances of many media companies around the world. In terms of online usage, we see it's up in some countries, down in others, but many of us have become more dependent, even more dependent on the smartphone during this crisis. So it's worth noting that before coronavirus, Africa was more heavily focused on the smartphone than many other countries. So around 80% say that they access the news weekly via smartphone, compared with something around 60% in Europe. So quite a significant difference, and it's grown again this year. And again, I think this speaks to the acceleration of trends towards digital, towards more social, towards more mobile access over the last year. One piece of good news is that we have seen a significant increase in trust in the news over the last year. So 44% across our whole sample of 46 countries say they trust most news most of the time. That's up 6 percentage points, and that kind of reverses a sort of decline in trust that we've been seeing in recent years. So it may be that sort of fact-based, evidence-based coverage of COVID has made the news feel a bit more straightforward. It may be COVID has sort of squeezed out partisan politics, which tends to undermine trust. So lots of different potential reasons for this. Trust in distributed environments like search and social media remains significantly lower than overall trust, and that sort of trust gap has grown. So again, suggesting a sort of flight to more reliable information as a result of the pandemic. But we also see really big differences across countries. So I've sort of divided this up regionally. These are the scores for each individual country in terms of trust. And it's interesting to see that the African countries actually do pretty well in trust compared with many other parts of the world, well above that average of 44% that I talked about earlier. Kenya is actually second to Finland in terms of our entire sample of 46 countries. This may just be because the sample is a bit more educated. But I mean, look at the trust levels in countries like the UK and the US by comparison. Only 29% in the US say they trust most news most of the time. And of course, these are countries where we've had these really deep political arguments about, stolen elections, about Brexit, around race in the US. And so those sort of polarizations, the media is very much mixed up with that. And we don't really see that in Africa in quite the same way. The media plays a bit more of an independent role, it seems. Moving on to misinformation, and we see a slightly different story here, because here, Africa, people are more concerned about false and misleading information being spread than in other parts of the world. So the highest level of concern, 74%, compared with 65 in Latin America, which is where we also see a lot of misinformation being spread, much lower in Europe and North America. And in terms of types of misinformation, people now say they are seeing more false and misleading information about COVID than they are about politics or other subjects. So over half, on average, across all of our countries, over half say they've seen some kind of false or misleading information about COVID in the last week. That is 71% in South Africa, so much higher. And then when we ask about who's responsible, who is it who's spreading all this misinformation about COVID, we find it is domestic politicians that are mentioned most often, followed by ordinary people in resharing misinformation, for example, or activists, anti-vaxxers, and then journalists. So some people, of course, blame journalists for spreading false and misleading information in the media. Again, the politicians' figure is higher in Nigeria, it's higher in Kenya than it is in many European countries. And then in terms of the platforms via which COVID misinformation spreads, again, we see this very different picture depending in which country you live. So in Nigeria, for example, people are as concerned about WhatsApp as they are about Facebook, whereas in the UK and the US, it's mainly around Facebook, and the same is true in Brazil, Indonesia, India, WhatsApp is really one of the key networks for spreading misinformation. And that's, of course, worrying because it's much harder to sort of spot misinformation and debunk misinformation in these closed messaging apps. One of the big concerns at the moment is about the sustainability of media, and maybe this sort of rise in trust is giving an opportunity for more people, more publishers to start charging for news directly, getting readers to pay. We've seen many African companies sort of starting with subscription models, News24, for example, in Africa, or membership models like the Daily Maverick. Across the world, we see a further increase, partly because of COVID, of the proportion of people who are paying for online news, but mainly in a sort of a small handful of richer countries. So in the US, for example, around a fifth, 21%, say they now pay for online news. That's up. That's doubled in the last few years. And much of that will be to the New York Times or the Washington Post, these sort of big national titles. We've seen increases in other parts of Europe and in Nordic countries. In Norway, you have 45% of the population saying they're paying for online news. It's very, very different in countries like the UK. Only 8% say they pay for online news. And of course, very few people are paying in Africa as well. So it's mainly sort of richer people in a handful of richer countries so far, but this is definitely a movement towards more direct reader payment. In terms of why people are reluctant to pay, so those people who don't want to pay, it's mainly because there is just so much free news around, either from individual providers or from aggregators or from social media. So lots of reasons why it's very hard to get people to charge for news. Maybe we'll pick up on that in the discussion. This year, we've also tried to understand in more detail how issues like gender, politics, race, and age play into perceptions of the media by asking how fair different groups feel coverage in the news media is to them. And then we've kind of expressed this as a sort of net score by saying the proportion who think it's fair, and then we've taken away the proportion who think it's unfair. And this chart really just shows how politics is driving some of those low trust scores in countries like the US. It really drives perceptions of fairness or unfairness. So people on the right, so these would be maybe Donald Trump supporters in the blue, essentially have a net negative score of 59 points, compared with people on the left broadly think the media covers them fairly. That's the pink. And we see the same picture in many other countries. So politics is one of the big drivers of sort of mistrust or sense of lack of fairness. The other fault lines around gender and age. Young people feel the media is often unfair in their coverage across countries, and women feel that the coverage is less fair. So not necessarily unfair, but less fair. And then we see lots of differences in terms of where you live as well. This is just the UK, but you see this huge perception that, if you're in the metropolitan areas like London, the media feels fair. But if you're a long way away in a rural area, people feel that it's less fair. In the US, we see the Midwest, southern states, for example, less fair. And in the US, we can also look at the issue of ethnicity, and perhaps not surprisingly, people from a Black or Hispanic background feel that the media coverage is often unfair to them. That's the sort of negative -13, whereas white people feel that it's broadly fair. So I think a lot of this sort of plays into sort of very current debates right now about diversity, inclusion, about whether the media is too focused on elites, on metropolitan areas, etc. And I think it's probably a different story in Africa, but it'd be, again, interesting potentially to discuss that in the panel. And then just sort of finally turning to the issue of, again, young audiences, which I know is a concern to sort of many publishers. It's been one of the key themes of the report in the 10 years that we've been doing it. And this chart, we ask people what their preferred source of news is. So do you prefer television? Do you prefer radio, print, social media, online? And this is for all countries, not just for Africa, but it's not very different. And you just see this extraordinary generational split. So older people, so that's the sort of the blue on the right, basically still prefer to watch television. So the medium they grew up with, essentially, maybe a bit of print. Younger people prefer online and social media. And look at those 18 to 24s, those digital natives who grew up with with digital and with social media. 40% of 18 to 24s say social media is their main source of news. It's their main source of news. And obviously that is extremely difficult then for publishers to build those direct relationships that are going to be so important for sustainability. In terms of what networks people are using, again, I've split this down by region, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but you can see really significant differences across regions in these charts. So actually people in our African sample use all of these networks more than in other parts of the world. But again, especially WhatsApp, it plays a bigger role. Instagram plays a very large role, and we're starting to see Telegram picking up as well in a number of African countries. I haven't mentioned TikTok yet, but across our entire sample, TikTok, this surprised me, is used now by about a third of 18 to 24s, and around 1 in 10 are now saying they use TikTok for news. Originally, when TikTok started, I thought no one was ever going to use it for news, but over the last year, we've started to see, you know, memes around coronavirus, about Black Lives Matter, around a whole range of of issues. And we find news organizations, you know, starting to experiment with how to tell stories in this news environment, often, you know, with humor and music. So it's a very different environment. Here are just a few examples. The one on the right is a BBC journalist called Sophia Smith-Gaylor, who did a fantastic sea shanty when the ship got stuck in the Suez Canal, and injected a little bit of public service information into her TikTok. So quite challenging to think about how to tell stories in these new environments. And we've also been looking at where people pay attention to. So when you're in those social networks, are you paying attention to journalists or politicians or ordinary people? And this is really interesting. Again, this is across all of the sample. But what we see is in Twitter, and to some extent in Facebook, people do pay attention to journalists. Often journalists are the ones leading the conversation. That's the dark blue line. It's where you pay the most attention. But again, look at Instagram, look at TikTok, look at Snapchat. It's not journalists at all. It's personalities. It may be comedians, footballers. You know, there's a whole range of influencers that are now leading the conversation, even when it comes to news. I think this is a really interesting and coming story, which is going to be important to get our heads around. So those are just some of the global findings. So I'm going to hand over to Chris Roper from Code for Africa, who helped us with the Nigeria, South Africa profile, just to talk a little bit about and contextualize some of the detail.
Thanks very much, Nick. Great, thank you. So what I'm going to do is just give you some of the kind of top level survey results, which I think we can then use as data to inform the discussion around Nick's larger presentation, which is super interesting and kind of scary in some ways and encouraging in one or two other ways. So in Nigeria, the top 5 offline brands are Channels TV, The Punch, CNN, TVC News, and BBC. And those 24-hour Channels TV and Punch basically dominate offline, with CNN and BBC big players online, along with Punch, Vanguard, and Sahara Reporters. The overall trust score is 54%, and I think for our purposes, probably one of the most important areas to interrogate here is around trust and misinformation, because I think that's in Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, we're experiencing quite a big onslaught on media freedom, and obviously part of that onslaught includes trying to destabilize trust in the media. So the overall trust score in Nigeria is 54%. Nigeria is the 7th most trusting country out of the 46 surveyed. And as Nick mentioned, Kenya is 2nd out of the countries at 61%, which is 11% up on the last survey, by the way. And South Africa is 12th at 52%. Access to news is very strongly mobile. And as Nick said, WhatsApp, Facebook, and YouTube top those networks in terms of where people access news. It's similar in Nigeria, but different in South Africa, where I think Facebook is most popular. Nick, do you want to go to? Oh, we're on Kenya now. Yeah. Sorry. Top 5 offline brands in Kenya: Citizen, Daily Nation, KTN, NTV, and Standard. It's quite different to South Africa and Nigeria in that the big international 24-hour channels don't feature there. They do feature very strong in the other two countries. And we might want to talk about, why that is. Is there, typically you'd say it's a mistrust in kind of government-owned newspapers and so on, which drives people to CNN and BBC. We're not seeing the same thing in Kenya. You want to switch to South Africa? South Africa, the top 5 offline brands are ENCA, SABC, BBC, Daily Sun. Online, it's News 24, SABC, ENCA, CNN, and Daily Sun. And the Daily Sun entry is quite interesting because it's top 5 destination offline, biggest selling daily newspaper. It's top 5 destination online, and it's also the bottom of the brand trust scores. So that's something that African media analysts are probably going to want to unpack a little bit and take a look at why that is. The top trusted brands are BBC, News 24, and ENCA, which has been similar in the last 3 years that we've done this survey. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks. So I'm just going to finish maybe with just a few questions. So I think what we've seen in this report is COVID really accelerating a lot of those trends towards digital change, and that is really putting pressures on the funding and therefore on the independence of the media. On the other hand, we've seen more trust. So how can we build on that trust to help traditional media and to invest in journalism? We find that only a few richer people broadly are paying for online news, not paying. How much, is it possible to charge for online news in Africa? And if not, then how are we going to fund sustainable media? What about those questions of diversity, inclusion? How can publishers win over, and also how they can win over younger people who have these very, very different habits? And in many cases, journalists are of a different generation themselves. So how can we bridge that generational divide gap? These will be maybe some questions we could discuss. I'll hand back now. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Nick. Some really interesting points for discussion, and I want to really get right into it and then bring in our panel in here. I want to understand from you guys, because this is the first time the report comes out where the results sort of include the time that we've come or we're in, that is the pandemic. What are your perceptions of the public's trust in news in your respective countries and for your newsrooms? Do you think that this score would have been different without the pandemic? Jamila, I want to come to you, but also touch on that question that Chris raised, where foreign TV stations don't appear at the top for Kenya. Why is that?
Thank you, Shapo. I think what we witnessed during the COVID-19 pandemic was almost unexpected to some extent, because as Nick mentioned, we had a large number of the population, the world's population. I think I was reading a report by AFP, about 3.7 billion people across the world were in some form of lockdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot more people were at home watching television for news. And mentioning that in television, traditional TV is trusted for news is actually quite true, in my opinion, because of the era of fake news we live in and propaganda. It is real. And there's this novel virus that no one knows much about that has literally brought the whole world to a standstill. And then people now need to go back to what they believe in, the trusted news, traditional news that they've watched all their lives, to get that information about this pandemic that is affecting their lives. And in Kenya, that is what happened. We had a survey done by the Media Council of Kenya. I'm trying to look for the figures, but it showed during the period of between April 2020 and July, we had over 400,000 more television news viewers compared to the same period the previous year. In Kenya, we had the first case of coronavirus in March. Early March, and by the end of that month we were under lockdown and more people watching television. But then now this did not really translate into maybe more revenue for the media houses in terms of advertising. About 30%, most companies lost advertising up to 30% or even more, because no one was really advertising. And I remember I asked our commercial director at Citizen Television, and he said for some advertisers, they felt it would be almost insensitive when people are under lockdown, people having lost their jobs, telling them, buy my product, buy my product. So some of them actually stopped advertising because of that. And then now we look at now how even journalism itself was affected in terms of us doing our jobs. I work for Citizen Television, which is the leading media house in terms of viewership. And we had to let go of a lot of our members of staff. We had to put others on contract. As I speak now, we still work on a form of shift basis so that we try to have the fewer people in the office. We've divided the whole team into shifts, from producers to news anchors to reporters to editors. To date, we're still working on a shift basis. It has sort of worked because we're able to still tell the stories as we used to, but not as we used to, because one of the things that was affected is even stories like investigative pieces, like features. People are unable to travel as they used to tell stories because there isn't any money. The money that you're expecting from advertising and all that is no longer coming in as it used to. So journalism itself, the art of telling stories, has been affected to some extent. And then come the pay cuts. I think all the major media houses in Kenya were affected in terms of 30%, almost 50% pay cuts for their workers. I think 1 or 2 media houses are recovering now. But then now the work still has to be done. And I think for me, I commend journalists in Kenya for going the extra mile to be able to still tell the stories. And I think part of the reason why local media is doing better compared to the foreign one is because Kenyan journalists have discovered the act of doing day 2 journalism on day 1. We have the mobile phones, we have internet, we know what's going on. Right now, we're having a whole debate about constitutional review in Kenya. By 7 p.m. in the evening, we already know that this is what was discussed today. So we need to tell people a bit more than what they've been listening or hearing the whole day. So I've noticed that Kenyan journalists are going out of their way to tell you more by the time you switch on the news at 7 o'clock. And no one else is doing it, only the mainstream media is doing this. And for this, they've been able to capture that audience in Kenya. The trust has gone up, that's good news. But how do we keep these people on? With all the challenges of streaming, Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, we need to keep these people on. What do we do to keep them watching?
Thanks, Jamila. Some really interesting insights there from a Kenyan perspective. Adesola, I want to come to you. What's the situation like in Nigeria? Would the trust score been different without the pandemic, especially following the protests last year, the NSAS protests?
Thanks very much, Shiko. Yeah, so in Nigeria, there's very similar to what Jamila has just said. The traditional media are, basically on top of reporting issues around, the NSAS protest, even basically the COVID, when COVID pandemic broke out. I think what is interesting to note is, as a digital platform, what basically helped us is the fact that we were already a nimble workforce, and basically we moved operations remotely, and that way we were able to cover events that happened from our remote locations, and then that didn't slow down the pace of work that we are already accustomed to. I think another thing we did, especially for the COVID, was releasing a state response index, and just for people to understand and see how their different states are responding to either lockdowns or providing healthcare facilities. In terms of the NSAS protest, I think what we also did was kind of be proactive, with the information that is out there, so report based on the protesters themselves, and not just the issues we're protesting about, what was on ground. And we were able to do that basically because back then it was also a lockdown, but we have moved remotely, so we're able to source for those information and work with people that were on ground, getting information and then sharing them, even despite the fact that we have a subscription product. So what we did was actually bring down the wall and then create free-to-read pieces with data visualizations, just showing on ground events and how it affects people. I think what was also really interesting to note was during the NSAS protests, there were basically a lot of ways to provide that evidence, online, digitally, for people to see exactly the extent, of the abuse, being, done to the Nigerian people. And I think that was, part of what helped to improve that trust, that the people, basically put in the media.
Thanks, Adesola. Ron, I want to come to you next. You spent most of the time at Fin24, part of News 24, during the pandemic, and then moved over to the Mail and Guardian most recently. What's your perception regarding the trust in news in South Africa for News 24, for Mail and Guardian?
Yeah. Were it not for the pandemic, I think the trust levels would have decreased quite significantly. Remember, in South Africa, just over the past 3 odd years, I think all mainstream media publications were called the Tumamina media. Like, remember that the whole idea was that the mainstream is kind of supporting the current president of the country and moving with his agenda versus his predecessor, who was run on this radical economic transformation agenda. And there are some houses that are more leaning towards that. So there would have been this bipartisan split, I think, in our media space, and hence the trust levels have dropped quite significantly. So I think the pandemic has just kind of brought everyone to almost find some sense of like established truth. So that it has helped quite significantly. I think where we're heading is, I'm not saying we were going anywhere near the US levels, right, where there has a clear split in that country, or the UK, alongside the Brexit and the Trump politics. But I think we were on a slope, and I imagine actually post the pandemic, and the more aware and tear, the more tired people have become about the pandemic and all the news about it, you can see that emanate again. So I think that the pandemic for me is like a helpful blip, I guess, and a good thing for us in the media industry. But I do think fundamentally the issues are still at play. Social media is damn strong. So it's still there as an influencer and feeding into that narrative that splits in the country. And we can see it. I mean, just this weekend we have this massive story, right, which is the potential arrest of our former president, and you can see just on the social media space, right, and especially in Africa, as all of us here in Kenya and Nigeria, we share the influence of WhatsApp, and you can see the tone shift again to that split, right? Even though there is a pandemic at the back, but everyone is reliant on some solid information of this what's going. We are in our 3rd wave and more deadlier wave than before, which is kind of in the back, playing off in the background, but you can see that split. So it's a helpful blip over the past year. So I'm very interested to see post the pandemic, and hopefully when we get all vaccinated and that goes to the background, whether we can able to maintain this given the political dimensions of South Africa, and I'm sure many other countries.
Thanks, Ron. I'm interested in how the trust, or what you think the trust score would have been, because the report focuses on mainly English media. How do you think that looks like for non-English media in South Africa? And I want to pose that to you, Jamila, and Adesola as well, but Ron, you can go ahead. Outside of English media,
I think in the same vein, there would have been that level of that. I don't think there's much of a difference. Anyway, media outside of English, it's not that. Yeah, so I would imagine, just on top of my head, that wouldn't have been much of a difference. But I think COVID has almost united us all in the crisis, what it is, and how do we get out of it. So I think along all platforms, all different media types, there would have been generally this positive shift that we've seen over the past year. Yeah. Jamila, Kiswahili is a big language in Kenya. How do you think that looks like for that specific media?
I agree with Ron. Actually, I think it's all across. The media house I work for also has 13 radio stations, all of them, or 12 of them vernacular. So they broadcast in all the different languages across Kenya. And I think that was the message across, that this is what COVID-19 is, this is what you need to know, the basics, wash your hand. There were campaigns all across the media houses, and that really helped build the trust. And what Ron mentioned is true. I think what we saw with what's going on in English, with the main English speaking television and radio stations, is what we saw with the vernacular, let alone Swahili. We have the Luo, the Kikuyu, who have about millions of people speak the languages across the country. So this was actually trust in terms of media and news and content really went up because of the COVID-19 pandemic and what they were being told by the media houses regarding it.
Adesola?
It's very much similar. So even though we in Nigeria, we're really large and diverse, ethnic groups and different languages, but I think importantly, we're still, very much English speaking. So if you look at, reportage from, even other international media, like the BBC, for example, they have, products or audio productions, visuals, and video as well in the different, major languages we have. You have Yoruba, you have Hausa, you have Igbo. So I think bringing that information to them, even in those, major languages, I think it would have still led to a high level of trust.
Thanks, Adesola. I want to bring the conversation to painful news, which Nick mentioned quite a bit in his presentation. And I want to understand what the situation is in your respective countries. How can trusted news brands encourage people to pay for online news on the continent? What's the situation like in Kenya, Jamila?
Recently, we started, some of the main newspapers have started putting up paywalls. And some of them say it's really affecting some of the online readers because they put these prime articles, what they call prime articles, behind a paywall. And for them, people are unable to pay for it. I think it's about $7 a year. That's what Nation Media Group is charging for that. And I was speaking to one of the editors and they're telling me now they're noticing that most people are actually not really paying for that to read the prime articles. But that's besides the point. I think people need to understand that what they are paying for and what I think the mainstream media houses are selling is credibility and reliability, and you are selling the certainty of facts, the clarity of it all. Because what we're seeing, this dangerous trend of fake news and the propaganda surrounding what is real or not, is what people need to look for when they're going to pay for content. Because as media houses, I think we use a lot of our time and effort to try and verify what we end up posting on our pages or what we end up publishing in terms of what is the truth. We know that as journalists, we're supposed to tell the truth and clear misconceptions. And I think this role of the media cannot be, is more important now than ever before. And I think for us, we understand how the price you pay for not having credible information on your pages. For instance, about the COVID-19 pandemic. If you don't have information about data, or you give fake information about data, for instance, you say 100 people died instead of 10. Or if you say, oh, Panadol cures COVID-19 as a main media house, or if you say we've had 60,000 new cases of COVID-19 instead of 6,000, and all those things, that look at the impact of something like that for a nation and the panic it can cause. So I think people should learn how to actually pay that 600 shillings, $6 or $7, just to get that credible news from a trusted media source. Where I work at Royal Media Services, because of the disruption caused by the internet and all that, they started a video on demand app, which people pay for. It's a subscription app. They have news, they have all our content online, they have interviews, they have everything that ends up on the television on the app. And with time, they have grown and made it into a service platform. And I was looking at the data and it shows about 3.7 million downloads, including the old app downloads. They have over 900,000 active users per month. And there are people who pay about $1 a month just to get the content. So that credibility that you're that information that you're giving, that you're sure is accurate, that you've done research on, I think is what people need to pay money for if they really, really want.
Adesola, Stears business is, most of his content is behind a paywall. How do we get people to pay for online news in Nigeria? Are people paying for online news in Nigeria?
Yeah, so first I'd like to mention that we are really aware of, the economic conditions of Nigeria. For example, we know there's a large group of high levels of poverty in the country. So, getting people to prioritize news as a product that, you should pay for is a very important decision they have to make. So I think what we do is first manage the expectations. So you have to let people that you want to pay for news know what to expect. For example, at Stears Business, our subscribers expect to get, one deeply analytical piece on the economy and business, a business model story or an issue that affects their life, for example, inflation or, the rising exchange rate. So when you have that expectation, these are stories that, you know, affect the decisions they need to take. And, you know, having that information, you know, at hand is always very useful in getting them, you know, to pay for a new service. Aside from that, we also try to engage in topical discussions. So for example, we have Twitter threads that break down, you know, topics just as they, you know, as they emerge. We also discuss basically innovative and even pick out, you know, issues around the economy that affect people. So for example, you will remember that, you know, the Central Bank of Nigeria recently banned youth from engaging in cryptocurrencies. But what really helped us was before that ban, we had taken out a week and, you know, broken down the different angles of cryptocurrencies, the good, the use cases, the bad, you know, how do you, you know, engage in trading crypto. And these are, you know, issues that affect, you know, that cuts across, it affects youth, and everybody's looking for, you know, a way to just, you know, get ahead and, you know, make decisions, make informative decisions. So being at the center, you know, of that discussion and being as a provider of that information, you know, just endears people, you know, to basically see us, you know, as a value-added service. And most of our products, for example, like I mentioned, during the NSAS protest, you know, we had to make all of those articles free to read. And even during the, when the pandemic broke, most of those stories that we wrote, still really rich analytical stories were, you know, free to read pieces. So we brought down the paywall for that. And when people see the level of information, you know, that they can get in those spaces, you know, they are moved to basically drop down some money and then pay for, you know, much more rich analysis that we provide.
Thanks. Ron, I want to come to you. What's the perception like for, I mean, having been at News 24 and now at Mail and Guardian, are people willing to pay for online news? And also the Mail and Guardian, you guys are distributing the continent for free on WhatsApp.
Like I was at News 24 when they started their paywall, and we were very, very like surprised and also encouraged by just how the take up from in terms of subscription. So there is that appetite. So there is a core contingent who are willing to put their money down and actually buy quality news and access. So it's just about what are you offering, right? So there is an appetite, but there's a limit to it, of course, given the constraints, imagine the economic constraints of the country. But in a world, especially for now where I am a Mail and Guardian and any other newspaper groups where I used to work before, Arena example, where revenues went away from print, especially during the hard lockdown and for the bulk of last year, there has been this massive shift to get ad revenues. Get revenues from readers. And I think something we should have done years ago. I think it's long delayed in the context of South Africa. I think what COVID has done is almost fast forwarded a bit, but I think we're kind of late to the game. We should have been on this and trying to convince readers to pay for it. But in essence, if you think about it, people always used to pay for news, and that's way back in the time before our time, in time when we just had print products and the like. So I think it's a habit thing. But before, so we can't. The problem is with publishers, and I guess most anyone who's run a media company that was initially print-based, they want to replace those revenues immediately that are going to be lost from the print products, right? And that because of that, it's almost like this ultimate. I tease and call it greed, but I understand it's desperation to replace those revenues. So in the costing of online news, they are looking to media to replace what is lost. But I think it's going to be a long game, like a long 10-year outlook, right, to get that those revenues back. And if you have that outlook in your headspace and know that this is money you've never had, right? If you're paying for, online subscription for a company that started a year ago, you've never had these revenues. Yeah. And so as long as you have a shareholder, I guess a publisher who has a 10-year outlook, I think there's growth there, and we'll take it to its logical end and into what the ceiling is. There's always going to be a ceiling. Not everyone, even before back in the day, not everyone was buying newspapers. It's always had like this. There was a cap to it. So we have these large audiences. You're turning around. Maybe if you get 5% of them paying for the content, I mean that's a good business case. So it is the business model. It should have been enacted 10 years ago, but this is always where we were going. News should have never in my book, never been free. It should never be, because there's people, the salaries we pay for, as Jamila is talking about, people have put work into this stuff, and it can't be free. It makes no sense. I know there's this whole question about democracy and transparency, and I understand that too. But at the same token, there are professionals that need to deliver a certain quality of content for readers, right? To uplift South Africa in the case of my country, and I'm sure the same with Kenya and Nigeria. It should have never been free. The ideas, I think now I can sit back, and I was there at, there was a Moneyweb vessel runs. I was there in 2003. I was a young intern. I remember the founder at that stage used to debate that, and he was like, no. And even at that, we were having those running debates about whether, even then as a young, watching those debates about free versus pay for content. That was 2003, having those debates. I mean, I think Financial Times started their Paywall 2002. But I think it's a move long overdue. COVID just speeded it up, because clearly the revenues from newspaper were gone overnight for some publishers and will be threatened their future. So to a point where, when I think of what is a sustainable business today, like a media a publication, is reader revenues. That's just the sustainability. You can't go anywhere else. You can't be chasing advertising revenues. We shouldn't chase them anymore. Like, and that's, in a perfectly run newsroom, my future scenario is that, like, the case where I really don't care about advertising revenues. I want to be there, and we have to work towards getting to a point where reader revenues, that subscriber, whatever the costing is, right? We can have a debate about whether 99 Rand a month or 75 Rand a month is the right price point. That is, like, we can have a running debate about that. But at some point, we have to get a business case where advertising isn't the sole focus of the newsroom, and it's about content, and it almost buys us our independence, right? If we focus on the content, because that is what brings in the readers and that brings in the revenues, then we are on a different trajectory. But until that point, and that's what I think we are on, and we all should have been on 20 years ago, in my book.
Yeah, Chris, do you want to come in there and possibly also speak to the question by Sihle, and maybe Nick come in after Chris, where he asked, can paywalls work in a context where platform companies share news? Is it feasible given the economic conditions in African countries?
That's kind of almost what I wanted to talk about. So I think the crucial things that Jamila and Ron have said here, I think, are that we're selling the news now. Right. So in fact, Ron, I think maybe news has always been free, even when it was on paper, because publishers were making their money from selling their readers to advertisers. Right. Currently, all reader information now belongs to the big platforms. That is why newspapers can't make money anymore, because they don't have an audience in that sense anymore. Even if they had millions of readers, those readers would still be easier reached by advertising platforms on Facebook and Google and so on. So I think that's the one issue. So I think Jamila talks about, that people are trusting news now because they need credible news sources, because it's a life and death thing now, right? So you need news sources you can trust. And I think you were also talking about how you want to be living in a world where you don't have to worry about advertising anymore. I mean, I think the time for worrying about advertising is gone, as has the advertising, in fact. And I think, for me, the best model right now of a news organization that makes money from their readers is the Daily Maverick, who've done that genius thing of having a membership drive where you become a member of Daily Maverick. The content isn't closed off. Everybody can still see the content, which means you get away from that whole problem about, like, are we keeping information from people who really need the information but can't afford to pay for it? And what they've done is they've educated their readers into believing that news is a thing that works in a certain way and that you can trust in a certain way, because it has all these mechanisms behind it. I mean, the last 3 years, the Mail and Guardian has been consistent in the Reuters survey at like around a 75% trust level, something like that, in 5th place. So it's like a super, super trusted brand, of course. The only way I think to make money is not from a paywall, but from another relationship with the reader, because what made you money before, not you, what made us money before in the media was our relationship with our reader. We used to sell them toothpaste, now we need to sell them truth. I think that's going to be the big difference in how we become sustainable going forward.
Nick, can paywalls, subscription, membership models work in Africa?
Slowly. I mean, I agree with Ron. I think it's a long game, and I think it's a mixed model. So, you know, there is always going to be free news around. And, you know, I think the challenge for those from a newspaper background is they can't do what they always did, which is try and, you know, produce a product for everyone or for large groups of people. They have to really focus on a specific group and serve them added value to what's available for free, whether that's in social media. And I think a lot of media companies are really thinking about no one model. So yes, you know, subscription or membership or donation may be a core, and I think reader revenue will be important for some. But in addition to that, you know, you can get advertising, you can do events. You know, most people are talking about diversification, 3 or 4 different revenue streams. And then you have to think about, well, how does local work, you know, and that comes back to sort of building not just content, but it's about relationships, it's about community, so that, you know, you're getting that sort of mix of local businesses supporting you and local people. So yeah, it's a much more complicated world, and it's going to be a much more complicated world, and it's a long game, as Ron says.
A very long game that we see ahead. We've got 8 minutes left for our discussion. I want to touch on other themes that sort of emanated from the report, and one of that was misinformation, standing at 74%, I think, for the continent. I've got a question here that mainly for you, Nick, around COVID misinformation. Is it possible that some respondents who mistrust mainstream information would class that as misinformation? A vaccine skeptic might see scientific data on efficacy as misinformation. Is there a way of correcting for that in the results?
No, it's, I mean, the question is absolutely right. You know, what people understand by the question, you know, partly depends on their starting point. And we've done, you know, focus groups in a number of countries about what people think about misinformation. It's very different from what journalists think about misinformation, you know, and a lot of it is about, you know, what we were talking about earlier, these sort of very polarizing debates about politics. So if you see something that you don't like, people often class that as misinformation. So a lot of it's around politics. I think what's interesting and different about this year is that some of it's about facts and evidence and about COVID, and you know, that takes on a different level. And I think what's been interesting, and we heard this from Jamila and others in the debate, is, you know, I think the media has really risen to the challenge in many countries in taking that challenge on and talking about facts and finding ways to display facts and answer listeners' questions or readers' questions in new ways and really accessible ways. I think that's been one of the real benefits. And I think we can apply that to many other stories as well.
Thanks, Nick. Tied to that is the issue of misinformation, is how high the number of the percentage where young people get, or at least most people get their news from, which is social media. And Adesola, I don't know if you can come in here, because I want to touch on sort of the low trust in the news people consume on social media and how journalists and media publications can change that. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a very interesting question. I think what we found, or what the report pointed out, was how the engagement of, you know, media houses and even journalists, you know, in social media needs to improve. So you find that the people driving news on, you know, channels like TikTok, Instagram are celebrities, they are influencers, which, you know, might have their own, you know, agenda. So I think what we need to do as journalists is engage our readers, our audience more, you know, on these platforms, and, you know, basically put out that information there. And even when they have questions, you know, answer whenever you can. I think another thing that we can, you know, begin to think about is, you know, basically a proper regulation of the social media space. So, for example, if an influencer is putting up a paid post or a sponsored post, we should be able to see that, oh, this information is sponsored, or this information has, you know, an agenda that is not just to basically enlighten people. That, you know, there's another reason behind it. So I think journalism engagement and then, you know, proper regulation of the space would help sanitize that low trust in social media.
Yeah, tied to social media is the percentage of young people who source their news from social media. In your respective newsrooms, what are the strategies that you are implementing to reach younger audiences? When is it the right time to reach those 18 to 24-year-olds when it comes to news?
Shepo, sorry, I'd like to come in here. In Kenya, the recent the information we've gotten from the national census that was done in 2019 shows about 75% of Kenyans are below the age of 35. So that's a huge percentage that you cannot ignore. So, and you need to play in their space. That's what we realized. They're big on the mobile, as you said. They're always looking at things on their hands. But we realized that for them, sitting through a 2.5-minute news piece is too much. That's too much time. You cannot expect me to sit and watch a 2-minute, 30 seconds news story. For them, it's more audio visual, more visual, make it shorter, 30 seconds, have some text on screen. I don't need to hear a reporter droning on and on. So we're trying to work towards that, have such types of stories on our platforms. And then I think also for them, you need to understand them. It's really, really difficult to understand what they want. They're very fleeting in terms of what the trend is now. So we're trying to follow them on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. And if you see from the survey, I think the Citizen is doing quite well in that space in terms of now getting to the youth. But we're also getting competition from what Adesola was talking about, having all these other people out there with content, especially celebrities. They go after the same interviewers that interviewees you're looking for. Could be the president, the vice president, and leader of opposition. They're going after the same guys on the same platform on YouTube. And the interview is completely, totally not on policy matters. Probably they're going more personal, what music do you like? So for us, we really have to try and find a balance from what we're trying to sell you as agenda, information, whatever. This is the manifesto, and with these other people who are coming here with now all this other information that is more interesting. Because you look at the views, 1 million people have watched it in 24 hours. Compared to the 12,000 who watched your piece on something more informative. So those are the same things that I think we struggle with in Kenya.
Ron, are we doing anything to reach young people? I know we're sending the content via WhatsApp, but you can't get any sort of stats on it. What is the Guardian doing?
Look, it's something that imagined, you've seen the Mailing Guardian with those 1,000-word pieces and deep analysis, right? That's almost catered. Somewhere like I've been here over 2 months, very catered for like almost an academic class, right? So I think so we are there, I guess, with that generation going to school and so on. So what the Mailing Guardian has to do, I mean, going forward, is take its product and almost have to break it down even further to make it applicable to how the youth consume their product, right? I think that the problem with the Mailing Guardian, where I currently work, is that in its own arrogance of we're important, we write the grand pieces, which still is still the same, and it's cool that we still do pretty much the same treatment of stories, is that we forgot that the reader left us. Our readers literally left. Their consumption habits have long left. You know, they consume news so differently, and we sat in one place thinking they'll come back to us, and that was almost the arrogance of the Mailing Guardian and other publications. I've worked in other publications, so what we have to do is to follow that trail and get news to them in the consumption, in the habits that they're onto now. So in my headspace, I'm thinking, I've got to think Mailing Guardian mobile first, PC second, and the print is third in that hierarchy, right, of stuff. And in so doing, so how do the youth consume content on mobile? So it's we've got to get a podcast environment going. Was the kids, the youth like that? I get visuals in at some point, which always was so that's a development that has come into play in how we take the Mailing Guardian and make it a visual product, to make it an audio product. So these are the things that Mailing Guardian has to start continuously doing it on a daily basis and get out of this funk of like, we're the grand Mailing Guardian, 75% trusted, admittedly, but what we fail to do is just follow where the market is. And South Africa is also pretty much like Jamila said, is a young populace, and their consumption habits have vastly transformed. And we've sat in one place thinking they'd come back to us. And I think that's a level of arrogance that I think media houses of old have had. And it's humbling, right? Because our revenues are shrinking. We are so insecure in our positions. But if we're going to get out of the slump, we're going to have to follow those habits. And it does mean actually disrupting the business. It does. And I think another thing to what I have, I'm an old dog, and I've seen this in a while. We are very uncomfortable with change in all newsrooms. And we're almost protecting the status quo as much as possible. And I think that has done us in my industry in South Africa, and I'm sure in other across the continent. But the coolest thing when I saw those stats is just how I mean, again, the continent is leading. 83% of people consumption habits are on mobile already. We're there. And I think it's for us just to get with that and get with the new consumption habits. So I'm very excited about what the Mailing Guardian can do and how we play with these different product platforms. And it's literally that's what we have to do and get out of our own heads. So.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ron. We've reached the end of our time together. I wonder if we can get one bit of last thoughts from the panel. Where do we see the future of your respective newsrooms or newsrooms in general in your countries or regions? And how do we see it? Are we going to adjust to the new normal with living with COVID? Where do we see the future for our newsrooms? Let's start with you, Adesola, 30 seconds.
All right, just to reiterate, like Ron and Jamila has pointed out, we really have to be innovative around product, audio visuals, data visualizations, basically. And let's not forget the digital training for the people producing this news product. So you have to have training for the journalists as well. You have to have a nimble workforce if you want to basically provide information in an environment where there's a lockdown. You have to have a staff that can work remotely. For example, you have to have staff that can use digital tools to create the kind of information that you want a large number of the populace, which in Africa, for example, is the young people. You have to have that expertise to be able to provide those kind of products and that kind of news service. So basically innovation around audios and around the different news products that we have out there.
Jamila, where do we see the future of news going forward?
I think we need to keep building on what we are, which is credible, reliable, and trusted. Continue with that, but also, of course, don't be left behind, as Adesola is talking about innovation. And the media houses now have to spend money actually on technology because they don't want to be left behind. Train your journalists also. This thing of mobile fast, having a phone, going out on location with a backpack and going live, all those need training. They make things easier, but they need training and they need investment in it. It's difficult during this time, but needs to be done. And I think also something else that media houses need to go back to is now the trusted, old and timeless values of simple things like right of reply. That trust will come if you have a story on television and you give someone a chance to reply to it. We need to hear both sides of the story. We need to go back to what journalism truly is. Tell the truth, but don't forget that innovation and technology also has changed. Do what you used to do, but now you need to now hop on their plane and follow everyone else in terms of innovation and how your stories are told.
Absolutely. Chris, where do we see the future of news in South Africa?
So first of all, I think if you're going to try and compete with platforms in terms of how you produce your content, you are going to lose and die a miserable and poverty-stricken death. I also think that it's way, way easier to get journalists, young journalists, newsrooms are getting much, much younger, to produce really, really cool and effective content. It's almost impossible, as I think Ron might have alluded to get the business side of newspapers to change. That is where the big problem is. Until we've got younger people in the business side and younger people changing the way the business works, the journalism is just going to suffer, and that's what we need to do. But I 100% agree with Jamila. The only thing we have left to sell now is credibility and truth. The entertainment value of news has long passed.
Ron?
Yeah, pretty much the same, like with all the previous panelists, right? And I think whether I don't think there's any return to any what we knew before, and good. I don't think what we were before we were sinking anyway. In any case, so I think it's all left us in a place where we're very desperately uncomfortable, and maybe that's good that we are in this uncomfortable place, and we have to find almost find our center and find a way to carry on. So it's actually, I think it's good. We're all uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable sitting here as the editor of the Mailing Guardian, or every night, the sleepless nights, and I think it's good. And I think that actually may just be the trigger that it saves the industry as a whole for the continent and globally maybe. So COVID has been good. I think, Jesus, it's stressful. I cannot say that more, but it's good. I think that comfort that we are in now, and just kind of understand that how do we remain relevant in this world is a good question, and it's here and it's now.
Yeah. Nick, closing thoughts. What next for the news, digital news report? Where do we see news going in the next couple of months as we sort of walk out of the pandemic?
It's been a fascinating discussion, I think, and you know, a lot of the themes that you've been talking about, and the responses, and the optimism, and the challenge, you know, we've sort of heard in all parts of the world. These are common problems, and they're to do with, you know, changing behaviour, the fact that the business model has been turned upside down and now accelerated with COVID. And I really like some of the, I'm an optimist by nature, and I think, you know, I also have seen a lot of innovation here. And the one thing that we've learned from COVID is that news, reliable news, separating journalism from the massive information that's published on the internet is more important than ever. So I'm going to hold on to that.
Awesome stuff. We only have our credibility and our trust as media. Ladies and gentlemen, apologies for going over time, but you know, we had a lot to discuss. We still have other questions that we didn't ask, but hopefully these will get answered as we go along. Thank you so much to our panelists, Nick, Chris, Jamila, Adesola, and Ron. I really appreciate your time and insights. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and staying on for this extra minutes. Please feel free to reach out and chat to us, email us if you have any ideas on how we can collaborate and drive actual impact through our different platforms and our various other channels. The details are on your screen on how you can easily reach us. Thank you so much again for taking the time to join us, and we hope to see you at the next Jamlab Meetup.